Well, Ambassador Christopher Landau, thank you so much for joining us for this series at the Wilson Quarterly and for the Mexico Institute. I'm going to start off with one kind of broad question, but I'm sure that you will have a lot of insight. As you know, the scope of bilateral relationships between the United States and Mexico is broad and deep, bound by geographical, historical, cultural, and commercial ties. Yet Mexico is considered by some analysts a tricky and sometimes uncomfortable partner for the United States. What are some of the challenges that you faced when you were ambassador to Mexico?
You are absolutely right, Lila, that it is probably the most complex diplomatic relationship on earth because it involves so many topics. You know, in many countries, we might have a tricky bilateral relationship, but it often boils down to a couple of issues. I mean, the US and Mexico have it all. We have a 2,000-mile border. We have obviously migration issues, security issues, commercial issues. Mexico is one of our top 3 trading partners. We have a whole host of other issues. We've got water issues, which are very important in northern Mexico and the western and southwestern United States. We have, agricultural inspections. We have, consular issues. I mean, with, Americans, far more Americans by a factor of, 10 or so, visit Mexico than any other country in the world. In fact, I think probably more Americans visit Mexico than every other country on earth combined in any given year. And likewise with Mexico and the United States. I mean, the U.S. diplomatic mission in Mexico that I had the honor to preside over is the largest U.S. diplomatic mission in the world. It's the embassy in Mexico City and 9 consulates general throughout the country. Similarly, Mexico has the embassy in Washington and 50 consulates all around the United States. So the depth of issues is vast. That being said, you have to prioritize, and if you want to actually make some progress, you gotta, I think, focus on a few key issues, and then the rest you just kind of deal with as crises come up. During my time in Mexico, and I believe this is still true, the big 3 issues were, as you might expect, migration, security / counter-narcotics, and commerce / economic issues and trade. And believe me, that was already a very, very full plate of issues. But, as you kind of alluded to in your question, it just begins to scratch the surface of the broader U.S.-Mexico relationship.
Yeah. And, Ambassador, as you know, security cooperation is sometimes considered a thorny issue in the bilateral relationship. I know that recently you argued that Mexican authorities have a duty to guarantee national security, and you urged citizens to demand that the federal government deal with organized crime instead of waiting for the United States to act. Yet President Andrés Manuel López Obrador has been clear that no country should intervene in the internal affairs of Mexico. So I wanted to ask you, what is your perception of Mexico's security strategy and its current cooperation on this matter with the United States? And then more broadly, has Mexico lost its battle against organized crime?
Let me say this, the security situation, I think, is probably the most challenging issue on the bilateral agenda right now. And, I start out with the premise that every country is sovereign within its own territory, and it's not up to Mexico to tell us how to run things in the United States, and it's not up to us to tell Mexico how to run its own security strategy. Notwithstanding that, both Mexico and the United States have a real common interest in addressing this problem. The United States, because we are being inundated with illegal drugs, and Mexico, because the criminal organizations that are sending those drugs to the United States are becoming ever more powerful within Mexico. But certainly, there is room for debate, and there is a healthy debate, as there should be in a democracy, about the best way to combat these kind of organized criminals. And President López Obrador was quite clear that he did not feel that the more militarized approach, just to use a tagline, but I don't think it's an unfair one, of attacking the problem head on. That was kind of the hallmark of the Calderon years, was not effective. And certainly that is a decision that the democratically elected president of Mexico is entitled to make. But, I think Mexico, for its own good, still needs a security strategy. I think we can certainly applaud efforts to, create programs, social programs for youth, midnight basketball, other sports, arts, all these kinds of things. But those are very long-term projects, and we're dealing here with some of the most sophisticated criminal organizations in the world. So the point I made in the article that you referenced, and that I tend to make repeatedly, is that we talk a lot about the joint problem that we face with organized crime, and it is a joint problem. But I think there's a danger in talking about it that way, which allows us to avoid accountability, where we come down to, our American officials come to Mexico and says, well, you need to do this and that, and ultimately what the security strategy Mexico adopts within Mexican territory is a Mexican decision. The United States cannot dictate the security strategy of Mexico, and just as Mexico cannot dictate the security strategy of the United States. What I think is a better way to think about it, sort of the way I think about it, is what can each of us do within our own borders where we have sovereignty and jurisdiction? So what I said is, the U.S., we can't be in the business of catching the bad guys in Mexico. That we don't have the authority to do that. It's not our country, right? So let's focus on what we can do on our side of the border. And, I've suggested some very specific things. I think we need to be very specific, and we need to say, okay, we need to be more aggressive in reducing the demand for illegal drugs. That does, I think, drive this whole problem. We need to be more aggressive in terms of breaking down the criminal networks in our own country. In other words, the drugs don't magically go from the Mexican border to the inner cities of Chicago, New York, Boston, Philadelphia, right? We have distribution networks in our own country that we should be able to tackle and bring those folks to justice. And third, we need to do a much better job in our side of preventing money and weapons from going illegally to Mexico. There's no Second Amendment right in the United States to send arms abroad to other countries in violation of those countries' laws and our own export control laws. So that's, I think, what U.S. officials can do on our side of the border. On the Mexican side of the border, it's obviously up to Mexico, but I think it's important that Mexico understand that the United States is not going to be there to solve the problem in Mexico. And I think the Mexican people need to demand results from their own government and not look to the United States to solve the problem, because we can't solve the problem in Mexico. And so, I'm afraid that we've done a lot over the years to kind of blur these lines of accountability, as opposed to saying, look, this is what we can do, and let's have some goals, because it isn't fair for the United States to come down to Mexico and say, well, you guys need to do that. And then the Mexicans say, well, what have you done on your side of the border? That's a perfectly legitimate question. And again, I think we both need to, kind of identify certain things that we can do. And again, that is up to the democratically elected government of Mexico to decide how it wants to go about this. But I think that's a conversation that's worth having.
It's very interesting, everything you just said, Ambassador, because I think another issue, right, that gets touched upon on both sides of the border is migration. And I know that while you were in Mexico as U.S. ambassador, immigration was one of the big, topics that you had to deal with the Mexican government. Remain in Mexico, the border, the wall on the border, et cetera. How was your experience negotiating with the Mexican authorities in terms of stopping illegal migration towards the US border. And what is your perception of how it's going now, considering there's been a surge in detentions at the southern border?
I think it is important, Lila, to recognize that the migration phenomenon has evolved quite significantly in recent years. And what was originally, back a few decades ago, almost exclusively a Mexican phenomenon is now, in large part, a non-Mexican phenomenon. And in fact, in 2019, when I first got to Mexico, I believe we saw for the first time in history more Mexicans than non-Mexicans trying to enter the United States across the southern land border. I mean, clearly, there were demographic pressures in Mexico back in the 90s and early 2000s, resulting from the incredibly high birth rates, in the 60s and 70s in Mexico. But, that is what it is. That kind of bump has passed. And, but now in the 21st century, I think we're seeing new migration challenges with transportation and communications really knitting the world closer together, where people can travel from small villages in Bangladesh on a plane to somewhere in the Americas and then make their way by buses or trains or walking, up the American continent to Mexico to try to enter the United States. So I think there's new possibilities open for the United States and Mexico to cooperate in controlling these flows of migrants. I mean, I think there's a number of dimensions to the problem. I mean, some people I think most people are coming because they're economic migrants. They want to come to the United States for the same reason that migrants have always wanted to come to the United States, for a better life for themselves and for their children. That doesn't make them bad people, but it certainly means that it doesn't mean that they can just come regardless of what our law says about these issues. And our laws don't allow anybody who just shows up at the border to come in. I think one of the challenges we have is that we have, after World War II and the plight of the Jews in Europe in particular, we created asylum laws that, we receive people, who are fleeing certain kinds of persecution in their home countries, persecution on the basis of race, religion, politics. These are quite narrowly defined categories. But, over the years, even though the law is the same, courts and administrations, frankly, have kind of reinterpreted the asylum laws to allow people to basically not just come in when you have, government persecution of kind of big groups of people, which was the game plan or the reason that these laws came into being, but individualized hardships, so that somebody says, I'm a victim of domestic violence. I mean, regardless of what everyone thinks of that, that is something that you cannot prove on a general basis, right? You need to have an individualized adjudication of that. It's so, whereas you can determine on a general basis, yes, there is a regime in X country that is oppressing and persecuting this religious minority. It becomes much more complicated when people come in with individualized stories about why they're entitled to asylum. And anyway, to make a long story short, we have seen that our asylum system has been, frankly, abused by people who are economic migrants, but come in and say, I check one of the boxes. And the problem is you cannot do 200,000 or 500,000 or 1 million adjudications at once. We just don't have the resources to do that. And for everyone, it's like when you widen the highway, you can start hiring more judges. Well, that will just encourage even more people to come. So what has been happening in the last few years is that we have been basically just letting people come into the country while their asylum claim is pending and say, well, guess what? We'll see you in 5 years, enjoy your time in the United States. So it has become a de facto way to enter the United States. And I think, again, that should be of concern, I think, to a lot of people, because we're getting very far from what the asylum laws were meant to do. And again, I think, long story short, during the Trump administration, through the Remain in Mexico policy and other policies, we managed to deter people from making this, very dangerous trip to the United States. My goal was to try to do more to facilitate legal work programs that allow people to sign up to come to the United States. They can make money and they go back to their country, as opposed to basically being trapped here. Long story short, things were working pretty well, but I regret to say it looks like the activists who were very opposed to those policies are now running the show in this administration. And I think we've seen scenes of chaos at the border where basically it has become a magnet to people from all over the world. And it's going to get much worse because right now we're still operating in a world where we're under pandemic restrictions of Title 42, which allow for immediate expulsion of people who are not authorized to enter. But that is, I believe the administration is signaling it's going to end within the next couple of months, and that is going to, I think, put more pressure on people coming. So I think migration has the potential to be a very destabilizing factor in the U.S.-Mexico relationship. But again, it's worth going back to the point I started with. The migration that we're talking about is now, in many cases, non-Mexican migration. I mean, our migration system was kind of built to address, adult male, usually single Mexicans who show up. The system kind of works to process those people. But when you start to have families, when you start to have asylum seekers, when you start to have people from all over the world, the system doesn't work anymore. And I think that's what we're seeing.
That's very interesting, considering, most of the migrants now are coming from the Northern Triangle, but as well as other countries in Latin America, like Nicaragua and Venezuela, fleeing from different critical situations that their country faces. So I think,
and listen, and not only that, I mean, there's a lot from Brazil, Ecuador, and it's not just Latin America. It's, some of the biggest numbers are from Bangladesh, India, China, Congo, Cameroon, Kyrgyzstan. I mean, it's kind of a United Nations down there. And I've just been seeing some reporting on, Russians and Ukrainians showing up at the border. So, again, I think in a sense, this gives me some hope that there are, grounds that the U.S. and Mexico can work on together to try to deter this kind of, Mexico from becoming basically a doormat for the whole world trying to enter the United States illegally. I don't think that's in Mexico's interest, and I don't think that's the United States' interest. But if our policies, I mean, we can talk about this, but if our policies are basically putting the incentives there, it's not going to get better by itself.
Very interesting. It's a complicated issue. I guess it's one of those, tricky issues that, are related to the U.S.-Mexico bilateral relationship. But Ambassador Landau, you were very involved in safeguarding critical supply chains during the pandemic. What are some of the lessons learned from the pandemic in terms of the U.S.-Mexico relationship, particularly with the partial shutdown at the border?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And that was probably the most dramatic time of my tenure in Mexico. I mean, we kind of knew we were going to face all these other problems, but obviously the pandemic came upon us unexpected. There's no rule book for how you deal with that. And I think one of the lessons that I drew is that our trade relationship with Mexico has grown so quickly that I don't think we have the structural safeguards built up around it that are warranted by its size. The number of American companies with some kind of manufacturing operations in Mexico or supply chains that extend into Mexico is vast. I would say you probably have to, for larger American companies, it's probably easier to count who doesn't have a presence in Mexico than who does. And a lot of times, again, this is not just a direct presence. So you have the X and Y, company in the United States with its facilities in Mexico. You have just, Mexican companies that supply critical parts. And, for instance, a car nowadays made in North America may pass, at different times, parts of that car may go over the border, I don't know, 20 times. As you know, components are added, then that piece is sent back and more is done to it there, then it's sent back again. And it kind of, things keep going back and forth. And so, almost overnight, as you and your listeners will recall, in mid-March 2020, basically everything shut down. We shut down the embassy in Mexico almost overnight. And I'll tell you, one of the first calls I got was from the Secretary of Agriculture saying, whoa, wait a second, what's going on here? I heard you guys are going to close the mission. But, you realize that the visa program that allows, people to come up to the United States with work permits, H-2A visas to harvest crops is critical to our food security. I said, Mr. Secretary, I understand that perfectly. And, we will make sure to keep our operations here moving. Because I recognize that, food security is national security. And during the entire pandemic, and my hat is off to folks on our team in Mexico, we managed to fulfill every, busload of people that went north under that program. They all got their visas, and that continued to work smoothly. But, so in Mexico, things shut down pretty quickly in the end of March 2020. The government in Mexico actually had a single federal definition of what was an essential industry. And curiously, it was come up with by the Ministry of Health in Mexico, not the economy ministry. So you would think that the people in the health side of things wouldn't really understand what is an essential industry for economic purposes. And I think that was certainly an issue that I think we should flag to make sure that the right people who understand these supply chains are making these decisions. And so in Mexico, basically, you were only essential if you were involved in health, security, or transportation. So, there was no national defense, there was no, services or, air conditioning or, whatever. People tried to get around that by saying, well, I provide air conditioning for a hospital. You'd be shocked if you knew how many people, hospitals, like, they require a little bit of everything. But, a company that installs carpets can't be necessarily deemed essential because the hospital needs to buy carpets sometimes. At some point it can be, it starts to just collapse outwards like a row of dominoes. But I think what we need to do, and in the United States, by the way, we had this definition not at the federal level, but at the state level. So we basically had 50 different models of what was essential. And we had some federal guidelines, but states were free to adopt their own guidelines as well. So, in a lot of instances, a particular industry was deemed essential in the states and allowed to continue operating, but they were not getting the components that they needed from Mexico. And so you can imagine in April and May of 2020, I and my team were just getting inundated with requests by American companies saying, whoa, wait a second, hair on fire. If we don't get these parts from Mexico, we're gonna have to shut down in 5 days. And we managed to work through our contacts in Mexico at both the federal and the state levels. Even though these requirements or these standards were imposed at the federal level, they were still enforced to some extent at the state level. And so the states had a role. And frankly, it was one of the times I think that federalism in Mexico really was meaningful. And so we spent quite a lot of time working with state governors who understood, the economic importance of some of these plants. And I was very frank in Mexico. I said, look, we have built these supply chains over the last 30 years. It has taken a lot of blood, sweat, and tears from a lot of people who sat in my office before me and in a lot of offices in both countries. And I said, but these kind of things can be destroyed overnight. If the word on the street is that you cannot rely on your supplier in Mexico in a crisis, well, guess what? That supplier is not going to remain in Mexico much longer. And in fact, I thought it was kind of ironic because this, in a sense, was a great opportunity for Mexico because the supply chains between Asia, and particularly China and the United States, frayed to kind of step up to the plate and show that, in fact, Mexico is reliable. And, in fact, I think that's what ultimately happened. I mean, there was a lot of, chewing gum involved in kind of sticking all the pieces together, and calls that were done informally, whereas I think we need to set up a more formal mechanism to coordinate supply chain maintenance in the event of a crisis. To me, that's one of the things that should be at the top of the bilateral agenda. And again, I don't think this is at all a partisan issue. I just think it is in everybody's interest to do it this way. And, I hope we get that done. I've been talking about this for 2 years now since it happened. I don't know that anything has happened in response, but these issues are too important. Again, these supply chains have grown too important for both countries to be left to, random phone calls to different people.
Yeah, and I think it shows just how interconnected and interdependent, the economies truly are. And the pandemic just kind of really just highlighted that aspect of the relationship. Ambassador, I have to shift gears a little bit. I have two more questions for you. The first one would be, what is the role of Mexico in the international community? And I mentioned this in terms of the relationship with the United States, because the AMLO government has become close or shown a proximity to certain governments considered anti-democratic, like Cuba, Venezuela. It abstained from voting against the dictatorship that's happening with Daniel Ortega in Nicaragua, but it also has close contact with Russia and China. Should this be of concern to the United States, that its neighbor perhaps is aligning or at least favoring certain governments that have an anti-democratic tendency?
Look, I'm an American, and it doesn't seem to me appropriate for me to be telling Mexico what its foreign policy should be. I mean, that's for the Mexican people to decide, and their democratically elected leaders. I mean, all that I can do, it seems to me, or that Americans can do, is kind of say, look, at the end of the day, your future really rests much more on your relationship with us than on those other people. I hear your question, but I think in truth, President Lopez Obrador is probably less active on the international stage than almost any other Mexican president in the last 50 years or so. I mean, I think he has been pretty clear that, he thinks the best foreign policy is a good domestic policy. And, so I don't really buy the narrative that Mexico has been, super active, on that stage. I think if anything, they've been less active than usually. Mexico is the largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. It's kind of a natural leader in Latin America. And there have certainly been times, particularly in the 60s and 70s and 80s, when Mexico, kind of fancied itself a leader of a third world bloc. And, it's not unusual for particularly Mexican rhetoric to be, somewhat distinct from the United States in international matters. But I think things have changed, and I think, this is a leftist government in Mexico, but I think it still makes no bones about the fact that its primary international relationship is with the United States. I don't think anybody really can seriously question what side of all these issues Mexico is ultimately on. Does it do everything that the United States would like it to do in the international stage? No. But, I think particularly in light of our trade agreement that has bound our countries so closely together, I don't think that's a mystery to anybody in Mexico that at the end of the day, Mexico and the United States are on the same team. That doesn't mean that we won't have our differences, but I don't see any signs that Mexico, is seriously, kind of considering going with an anti-American group at the expense of its relationship with the United States. I mean, I think it's kind of telling that President Lopez Obrador's first visits to foreign countries were to the United States. And I mean, I'm not sure where he's traveled recently, but as of
He hasn't.
yeah, I mean, I think as far as I know, the only places he's gone internationally as president has been to the United States.
That's right.
I think he came during the Biden administration, and I think he during the Trump administration. He went to the United Nations once in New York, and then I think he's come up during the Biden administration. To me, that underscores that, to me, he actually has a more pro-American foreign policy than did, let's say, the pre-governments of the 70s and 80s. And, I mean, obviously, there are different factions within Morena, as there were in the pre. And, some, I think, feel a more internationalist solidarity and are more into what is going on in other countries in Latin America. I think President Lopez Obrador, frankly, understands perfectly well that the relationship with the United States is by far the most important relationship that Mexico has, and I think he's conducted the foreign policy according to that.
Very interesting analysis, and I think you're right that he does understand the importance of the relationship with the United States. And then one final question for you, Ambassador. I know that when you were in Mexico, the Mexican population was very grateful that you were very involved in cultural activities and the food scene in Mexico. I tell you because at that time I was in Mexico and we all considered you almost Mexican, right? So what are the cultural ties, right? Are they very deep between the US and Mexico, not only on security, commercial, geographical, right? But there's also, I think, a very deeply rooted cultural relationship.
You're 100% right. I mean, look, I think about 10% of the United States population can trace its origins to Mexico. Our countries have become, very intermingled. Again, not only in terms, as you just very eloquently put it, of trade and commerce, but also at a human level. I mean, the many consulates that we have in each other's countries reflects the fact that our relationship is really made up, I like to say, not so much just of presidents and ambassadors, but of all of us. Just millions of people on both sides of the border who have relationships on the other side of the border. And I must say, you are correct. I'm a big fan of Mexican culture. I admire it. I enjoy it. From food to art to music. It's something that I feel very comfortable with, having grown up in Latin America myself. And for me, part of what made that experience in Mexico so wonderful was experiencing that culture and getting to see so many of the different facets of Mexico. I mean, Mexico, as you know, is a huge country. It's 130 million people. If you put it on a map of the United States, it would stretch all the way from Montana to South Carolina. And I think Americans sometimes have a little bit of a cartoon view of Mexico as, beaches or cactuses. And, I mean, there are many Mexicos. There is a very, cutting edge modern Mexico. You can see the skyscrapers on Reforma or the factories, in Guanajuato or something that are, space age, or in Querétaro, doing the most advanced things. And then there are, farms where subsistence agriculture goes on as it has for hundreds of years, indigenous communities. I mean, it's just a very rich country. And, I am generally optimistic about the US-Mexico relationship, looking at it long term, because I think in a lot of ways it's a very unique relationship in the world. I don't think, certainly the United States, I don't think has any other foreign relationship that's like the relationship with Mexico, where there are just so many, again, cultural components that go into it. I mean, if you think of Day of the Dead, Cinco de Mayo, things that are now becoming kind of part of American culture. And similarly, American culture is, they're doing Halloween in Mexico. I mean, I think we're getting a syncretism of both cultures, a cultural syncretism that I think is very healthy. I mean, I like to point out that when I was a college student in the 1980s, the lead book on the relationship with Mexico was called Distant Neighbors. And I think, by Alan Riding, the New York Times correspondent in Mexico City. And I think that's actually a pretty true perspective on the relationship at that time, that, the border had basically been a place where both the US and Mexico kind of had their backs to each other and didn't really engage that much. We didn't have that much trade or commerce. There just was not the kind of embrace of each other. I think that all changed. I think, probably largely spurred by the free trade agreement, but also by migratory patterns, et cetera. And I think now, the leading book is called Vanishing Frontiers. I think, in a sense, we can, we certainly disagree as countries about things, but I think the much bigger story that we can't lose sight of is that I think we both have so many links with each other, that when people talk about, oh, relations are tough or something, I mean, that might mean at the government to government level, but that is not the relationship between the United States and Mexico. It is so much broader than that. And I think that is a healthy thing for both countries. So I think that, US relations with other countries in the world don't have that kind of cushion, let's say, of natural understanding, and that basically army of ambassadors on both sides of the border that I think, prevent any kind of, serious, rupture from happening, or maybe put more positively, just will always keep us on an even keel, regardless of who occupies the White House or Palacio Nacional or the embassies in each other's capitals.
Ambassador, it's been an honor to interview you. Thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us at the Wilson Center and the Mexico Institute. Thank you so much for being here.
El placer es mío.
Gracias, embajador.